Okay, kia ora kōrua, and thank you very much for joining us on Zoom. We have here Tendai Mutambu and Fiona Amundsen in a series of talks for the Auckland Art Gallery Toi or Tāmaki that we've organised in association with the 2021 Walters Prize. And this is an opportunity that we've called Guests of the Artist to broaden the discussion and invite a guest in to make observations about the work and broaden our discussion. And in this case, we're talking about Fiona Amundsen's work, A Body That Lives, from 2018, that was nominated for this year's Walters Prize. A warm welcome to Tendai Mutambu, who is a writer, editor and curator currently in Tāmaki Makoto at Te Uru, Waitakere Contemporary. Formerly, Tendai was also assistant curator of commissions and public programs at Spike Island in Bristol, and has come back to Aotearoa, New Zealand after some time in London, where he has been developing a special interest in film production and is currently assistant producer of Preemptive Listening, a feature film by London-based artist Ora Satz. Fiona Amundsen needs no introduction, perhaps, other than the status as Walters Prize nominee in this context, but I want to point out also as specific to our discussion today. Fiona has exhibited widely in the Asia-Pacific region, as well as in the US and Aotearoa, New Zealand. She's also Associate Professor in the School of Art and Design at AUT University and completed her PhD recently, which explored alternative modalities for memorializing stories and experiences associated with the Asia-Pacific War and World War II, for which this work is greatly related. I'm going to hand over now to Tendai, who's also in 2018 written a text that closely links to A Body That Lives, for some further thoughts about the project and some questions for Fiona. Thank you. Tendai.
Kia ora, thank you, Natasha. And Fiona, it's a pleasure to be in conversation with you. It's been a while, I guess a few years, that we've been talking on and off about this body of work, this suite, and your ongoing practice as well. So it's really great to be able to continue that. So yeah, thanks for agreeing to be part of this conversation. And to Natasha, Amelia, and Lucy from Toi or Tāmaki, thanks so much for the invitation. So the work we'll be discussing today, presented as part of the most recent edition of the Walters Prize, revolves around the lives and testimonies of four people with whom you've built a relationship over the years, Fiona. These people, just to summarize that really quickly, are the Japanese-American war veteran Ben Kuroki, Japanese anti-war activist Mrs. Kayoko Ebina, the Japanese war veteran and former prisoner of war Mr. Tereo Murakami, and the Okinawan anti-war activist, Mrs. Michiko Uehara. And I guess one of the things that's central to these works, or to the suite of works, is what you've described as visual listening or documentary listening. And I wondered if you could give us a sense of what listening means to you in the context of this particular suite, but also how it functions within your practice.
Kia ora, thank you, Tendai. It's so good to be in conversation with you. And like you said, you know, we've been talking over the years and back and forth when you're away, and it's just wonderful to have you back in Aotearoa. So to start with answering that question, of course, this idea of listening comes from the Indigenous filmmaker Barry Barclay, who talked about, you know, can we make the camera into a better listener? And you know, he says, as Māori, you know, you're taught to listen, you sit at the feet, you open your ears and you wait. And I remember when I read that, it really struck with me in the sense of, there's something very similar about my experience of being in a Japanese context where I sit at the feet, I open my ears and I listen. And then of course added into that is the complexity of language, of translation. So what I'm listening to I only ever understand it much, much later, meaning after it's fully translated. And so for me, listening is really this idea of you sit at the feet and you wait until the story is gifted to you. And, you know, that's beyond a fixed time frame. It's beyond a fixed moment or a fixed interaction. And then, of course, once that gift has been given to you, I think that's when also an immense sense of responsibility starts, in the sense of, you know, I'm holding something that has been entrusted into me. And so what I do with that, both in terms of an artwork, but also where the artwork is positioned, you know, how I make sure that the people in that work are kept safe, it all comes back to this careful listening. And so for me, listening is the kind of, for want of a better way to put it, the bedrock of ethical engagement.
Yeah. And I think one of sort of the characteristics of this more kind of, I guess, expanded sense of listening is the way that you seem attuned to as much to what is said and what is given, what is presented, as sort of what is absent. And I think a really interesting kind of visual analog of this, or an analog of it formally that appears in your work, is the kind of the use of the black screen, the kind of the silences, the pauses. And I'm interested in your kind of inclination towards quietness or quietude, and your decision to punctuate. You know, you have this very kind of loaded and heavy archival footage, and then we see all these, I guess we see these bombings, and we see the aircraft and all the sounds and so on that come with that. But then obviously sort of interspersed within that are these moments of stillness, of quiet. And I'm curious about the function of that, the function of those moments of stillness and quiet.
Yeah, definitely. That use of, or developing the use of black screen was, I think it was quite a pivotal part, or a pivotal moment in, you know, in the development of this work. Sorry, that's a motorcycle going past. I don't know if you heard that. And I guess what I was really interested in is, well, there's so many things, but ultimately, yes, it's black screen. And sometimes it's black screen where we only hear audio, and that audio is a mixture of English and Japanese. But I think the black screen also creates this sense of, almost in a way, a stronger sense of imagery. And it's both the imagery that has just been viewed, you know, as you said, the heavy archival footage, my own footage, but it's also the imagery that's imbued in what the person is saying, because these are, you know, these are strong descriptions of experience, and they're traumatic experiences, and they're by four people who, you know, were and are in the business of publicly telling their stories, so they know how to tell their stories. And so I wanted to create this space where we get even more attuned to that work of listening. And I really think that listening is work. You have to do the work. You got to put the time in. And that black space was also, or the use of black screen is also about not necessarily matching up what's said to what's known, or supposedly known about these particular histories. And of course, the archival documentary footage is very much trying to give you a, hey, this is how it was, this is how it transpired. And I want to rupture that, any sense of connection. And so I guess I'm hoping that the black screen helps us listen to not only the voice, but it helps us listen better to the imagery we're seeing. So it helps us listen better with our eyes as much as our ears, or also our whole bodies.
Yeah. While I was preparing for this talk, actually, I was reminded of, there's a line from Sans Soleil by Chris Marker, the really brilliant essay film. And the voiceover says, or refers to small fragments of war enshrined in everyday life. And I was thinking about that as I guess, an evocation of sort of a big picture history that we might see writ large, and, you know, these images of war and battle and all these other kind of things that we would readily associate with, you know, the sort of capital H history. But then also thinking about its relationship to the ordinary and the everyday. And it brought to mind your work, of course, because I was thinking about your juxtaposing this archival footage, again, like I mentioned, of the airstrikes and the war and so on, but then putting that against the kind of subjective first-person accounts of what it means to live through this and to experience it. I'm curious about your choice and your decision to put alongside one another the declassified archival material, your own footage that you capture, as well as the kind of those more intimate conversations as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a brilliant reference to the Chris Marker work, absolutely. I'm going to answer this in a sort of roundabout way, and I'm actually going to answer it by talking about Aikido. So roughly at the same time that I started making this particular series of works, I started practicing Aikido. And Aikido very, very loosely translates as harmonious sort of mind and spirit. And so Aikido works with non-combat. And of course, what I realize now, I didn't realize it at the time that I was making the work, is how much the Aikido practice has influenced the way I use the camera, but also the way in which I work with editing. And in Aikido, you're constantly listening, listening in an embodied sense or a bodily sense to what's just happened, what's about to happen, but also across 8 planes of direction. So up, down, front, back, and then the 2 diagonals. And in a way, I think that's what I'm trying to get, this kind of combination of archival, very fact-oriented footage, also propaganda footage, very imperialist driven, with these very personalized accounts, is that we have to take on this total embodied sense of listening, and this total embodied sense of connection. And it's not about one undoing the other. It's like, how do we hold those contradictions at one time? And this is where the Aikido kind of links in, is that with Aikido, you're constantly holding multiple spaces at one time. And there's a concept in Aikido called Zanshin, which when I heard it, I was just like, that's freaking amazing. And Zanshin, it translates as remaining mind or remaining consciousness. And in Zanshin, in Aikido, Zanshin is about practicing that awareness to what's just happened, because what's just happened is going to inform what happens next. And our Aikido teacher uses the example when he is describing this concept. He talks about, imagine pausing the video. Just because the video is paused, it doesn't mean it can't rewind or go forward. Like, what went prior is going to inform what happens next. And I think that's an incredible way in which to take on this idea of a history that breathes itself in the present, both by the archival images that exist, by the lives that are still being lived, but also by the geopolitics of the region, our region right now. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, it absolutely makes sense. I guess we can come back to the idea of the geopolitics of the region, thinking about the Asia Pacific more broadly. But you mentioned contradiction, and I think that's sort of a good way to capture what some of this work is doing. Thinking specifically of, I guess the statement that's at the start of the work, and it says, "You helped light this flame." And I remember when I first watched the work, I was thinking it immediately resounded with an air of accusation or something. But then the more I thought about it, and I just realized that it's sort of prefaced by a description of, so it's Mrs. Uehara speaking of the many monuments from which the flame of the monument on Okinawa is derived, right? So it's like all these different parts brought together to inform this whole in a new place, I suppose. And I'm curious about the sort of import, the significance of that statement, and why you chose to place it at the start, and perhaps how it relates to another statement, which is, "You helped do this." how we're supposed to sort of read it and approach that statement as it's presented in that particular part of the work.
Yeah, you helped do this. That comes from an image, an archival image, which was in Ben Kuroki's, he called it his memorabilia, which exists at Smithsonian now. And that image is actually also in the exhibition. But that image is it's an aerial photograph taken of Tokyo not long after they had bombed it. And it has this, you've seen it, it has this text that says, "You helped do this." And then it lists, the supposed amount of area that's been affected by the burning. And I was really struck by this sort of strange combination of celebratory and accusation at the same time. And when I started this work, Ben was the first person I met, and that was in 2013. And Mrs. Urahara was the last person that, well, she's not so much the last person I met, but Okinawa was the last work that I made in this series, and that was in 2018. And so that's a 5-year span between them. And of course, my work changed over that time frame. And I was trying to think of a way to bring the Mrs. Urahara work together with this experience of meeting Ben and this kind of accusation of "you helped do this." And I started to think about, actually, we all helped do this, in the sense of how do our bodies represent in the world. As a Pākehā, I helped do this through the settler narratives that I come from. For a Korean audience or a Chinese audience, they helped do this simply by the fact that they're alive, in the sense of Japan's imperial occupations, atrocities. And so that text that you referred to at the beginning of the work with Mrs. Urahara, I actually wrote that, and it's not her speaking. It's my connection to Japan, which I have a deep connection through a family and through one particular person. And I talked with her about how I could bring that connection into the work, but without just sort of giving it over. And so I wrote that, and then it's actually her speaking, and we thought about it in the sense of she's speaking to the 4 people and to the 4 histories that are in the work in a way that I never could because of my lack of Japanese language skills. And so that's quite a personal anecdote that I've just sort of shared. But it was a really, really important way to have her in the work, but also to have me speaking back to the other works through Fuyuko, but through also positioning it in relationship to Mrs. Urahara.
Yeah. I thought we could move on to discussing, I guess, something that we're not privy to in this current moment in particular, but also something I became really aware of was when we started talking, I hadn't seen the work in its presentation at St. Paul Street. So, I couldn't really, I couldn't take in the detail and the choices that you made and the scale at which it presented the work and so on. But fortunately, I was able to see the work at Toi or Tāmaki and how it's been shown. And I'm curious about the use of the kind of the screens and the armature that you used to present the work. If I remember correctly, there's still the same kind where you can walk around, so the work almost functions in the round, if you will. Like, it's moving image work that's projected onto a surface, but you can kind of see both recto and verso. And there is a certain slightness to its presence, a kind of almost a ghostly delicateness to it, right? For me, that felt so consonant with the kind of the fragility of the historical image, right? This idea that we have these histories that we're always trying to catch and trying to capture, but there's almost like a fugitive quality. But I'm curious to just hear more about how you decided to present your work for this iteration for the Walters Prize.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it was super challenging, because the work was first shown across 2 separate galleries. And I also had to work in the foyer. So there was, a lot more space. So, in terms of thinking, well, how am I going to work with it in this much, much more condensed space? And I guess it's that thing where, and maybe this is also the Aikido training, there's no point pushing against the fact that the space is condensed. It's like, well, how do I work with it? How do I bring out more of that kind of condensed feeling? And so part of it is the way the screens are angled. And of course, in the first iteration, the screens were still on an angle, but that was more to do with the way your body entered the room. And your body and the screen were very much kind of parallel to each other, I guess you'd say. Whereas in this iteration, I wanted a sense where there was nowhere, for want of a better way to put it, there was nowhere to hide. You had to take on board these stories. And I wasn't so much interested in a person staying the whole time with one work. I mean, if that's what they wanted to do, fantastic. But I was very clear that you could get a sense of what you needed to by walking around the works, by spending time here, there, across the 3 audios in a way. And I think for that to be enabled, the body has to be activated. And that's what the screens do, in the sense of them being, they're rooted on the ground, they're really large, they're this combination of quite dominant because of their steel structure. But as you pointed out, what they do to the archival footage, particularly in terms of the fabric that the screen is made from, creates this real ghostly glow, both in front of you, but behind and above. And of course, there's also a sense when you're looking at one work, you're really conscious of the other works that are beside you or behind you. And so I really wanted to amplify that sense of the space being small, and in a way making it more claustrophobic. It was, I think, as a viewer, it's very hard to get out of what's going on with the works, in the sense of you're very conscious that while Ben's talking, Mr. Murakami's talking, Mrs. Urahara's talking, but you do get to focus on one moment. And I guess I didn't want the work to be, I didn't want it to be a comfortable view, in the sense of these stories aren't comfortable and they should never be made comfortable. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's brilliant to see how that plays out spatially. Even just like, the kind of polyphony of those multiple voices. Obviously in the making of the work, like you said, there's a kind of a half-decade span, but there's always a sense that there is something building up. And then again, those conversations that take place, like, for example, this statement that you mentioned, that's drawn from another work that shows up in a later work. I'm curious about the sort of comment that I kind of picked up on in the work To Each Other Way of Life 2016, which is, I guess, is drawing a connection between war and industry, war and labor. Let's say, I guess it's a kind of emblematic of the military industrial complex, that term you hear used a lot, but you hear like, there's that voiceover which talks about, a quote, Uncle Sam and our company together are spending over $700 million on a steel expansion program, end quote. And it goes on to say, because this is a war of steel. And I'm curious about that choice of placing that footage in that voiceover, and how it connects to the kind of broader sort of machinations of imperialism, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. In 2015, I had the opportunity to go to Pittsburgh and spend 3 months there. And, Pittsburgh is known for its steel production, amongst other things, but predominantly it's steel. And in 2014, I had met Mrs. Ebener, and, we met and I was setting everything up to film, and she only wanted to be audio recorded. And so of course we just did audio recording. I asked one question, and then an hour and a half later she finished talking, and there was no translation happening in the moment. But I could feel that something enormous was being communicated. And so I knew I had this incredible story, this incredible connection with her, but I had no image, so to speak. And when I was in Pittsburgh was when I finally had the whole hour and a half recording translated. And the woman who translated it for me, it took her quite a long time because it's so traumatic. So she was a Japanese woman whose grandmother had died in the air raids. So when I had the full translation, I was sort of thinking, I was still thinking, well, how do I image this? And at the same time, I had been reading about the role that steel production had for America in terms of World War II, and and as you mentioned, labour, and particularly labouring in terms of the production of like the war machine labour. So right from making bullets to helmets to the casing that goes around bombs, steel was the #1 ingredient. And I had been going out to visit this former functioning steel mill, which is now just basically a relic. And the scale of it is enormous. And then I just started to look at the details of that steel mill, in its derelict state. And I started to think about the bodies that had worked in there labouring are similar to the bodies that laboured in terms of actually fighting in the war. So I thought about Ben in that sense. And then I thought about the bodies that endured the fire. And that steel, is essentially a fire process. It's, molten hot steel is how it's produced. And I was trying to make a connection between the labour that was required to establish and keep the war machine functioning, but also the labour that was required to drop the bombs in the first place, and the labour that's required to endure and to keep living that history, which of course is in Mrs. Ebener's voice. So yeah, it was trying to make a connection between almost quite disparate avenues, but when I started thinking about it and actually looking at that steel mill, I just managed to join those attributes. But in terms of Pittsburgh's quite a small city, and if you took a kind of 5-kilometre radius from where you are now, they had, during the height of the war, they had 9 functioning steel mills, and these steel mills are enormous, so we're talking major production.
Wow. I guess one of the things that becomes like pivotal to that work is your conversations with, or the words of Ben Kuroki, one of the central characters through whom the tensions really start to play out. He's Japanese American, the only Japanese American, if I remember correctly, to serve in aerial combat for the US military during the Asia Pacific theater of World War II. So tell me a little bit about the kind of the role of feeling and affect, or in particular, actually, the tensions, the kind of dilemmas that play out in him as a person, things that are brought to bear as the tensions between shame and pride, and his relationship between Japan and America.
Yeah, Ben was really amazing. And actually, he died on September the 1st. And of course, what's the date today? Is it the 3rd of September?
2nd.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Oh, 2nd, okay. I'm a day ahead. He died September the 1st, 2015. So he died not long before I was in Pittsburgh. And so I was thinking about him a lot, and how his whole life was this. He died at age 98. His whole life was this battle of recognition. And firstly, after Pearl Harbor had been bombed, his father said to him and his brother, Fred, you know, it's a dishonor. Japan has dishonored us by doing that. The most honorable thing you can do is serve. And of course, you know, even his act of trying to enlist in the military was, well, obviously completely racialized in the sense that no one would enlist him. And they ended up, him and his brother ended up driving 150 miles to some hick town. So 150 miles from Nebraska where they were living, because some guy would sign up anybody because he got paid a certain amount of money per enlisting. And then of course, once he was in the military, his whole life was, military life was spent proving his worth to be in the military in the first place. And of course, you know, he's fighting for a war machine that doesn't recognize him, and that never would. So he first fought in Europe, and he participated in many more missions than he needed to before he was sent back for rest and relaxation. And then he was sent to California, of all places, which of course by then Japanese Americans had been rounded up and interned, you know, in the Midwest areas. And then he's kind of, his next orders are to go to the camps where Japanese Americans are and encourage them to enlist in sort of, you know, like menial administration type duties within the military. And he says this thing where, this realization that he was wearing the same uniform that the people who were guarding and keeping the Japanese Americans held in the camps. And, you know, he's constantly shifting back and forth between this wanting to prove his nationalism, his loyalty, his patriotism, but also never being able to. You know, it's always being recognized after the moment, if that makes sense. And, you know, when he finished the war, or sorry, when the war finished and he finished his service, he participated in 58 missions, which is huge. And then his next mission was to get the same recognition that all his crew members had gotten. So when the war finished, his crew were awarded, you know, a series of medals for their service. And Ben was the only one in that crew that didn't get that medal because of his Japanese status or Japanese ancestry. And I think there's a really, when he talks about the sense of shame and the role that honor plays, I think I was really interested in how that there's a double sense of it being linked to his family, linked to the stories his family told him about how he needs to be in the world, but how that was never recognized by the very country that, you know, was his home, if that makes sense. So he's always stuck in this conundrum of how to be recognized, you know, how to be honored, but at the same time by doing really, you know, complex things in terms of, you know, bombing his ancestral homeland.
I mean, very complex, and that really plays out in the work is, like I mentioned before, the kind of bigger picture cruelties of imperialism that we're so used to seeing, you know, those kinds of images all around and shown. But then I think what you managed to capture in that particular work by having, you know, having those two interlocutors in that kind of same space, the shared space of the work, is these more kind of, I wouldn't say smaller scale, but they play out obviously on the level of the familial, of like the kind of the personal and subjective. And so the work always seems to kind of oscillate between, like, you know, bigger picture industrial, bigger picture war, smaller scale personal, affective kind of like way of kind of managing or understanding the world. And then just to finish off, I thought we could just touch on, again, another figure for whom the sort of complications of wrestling with one's own, I guess, one's history, and particularly kind of like emotional impact of sort of histories lived, with Mr. Murakami in A Body That Lives, right? There is this like, this almost painful kind of sense of really trying to dig deep and search for some of those histories, but then also a kind of an evasion of not wanting to really confront head on what he experienced in the camps. So just as sort of a bit of context for those who aren't familiar, Mr. Murakami was, I guess, at the time that you made the work, a 99-year-old former prisoner of war who was held captive, I think, at number 12 prisoner of war compound in New South Wales in Australia. And the campsite was one of World War II's largest attempted prison escapes, and I guess one of the bloodiest on record. And it's informally referred to as the Cowra breakout. For those who aren't familiar with it, would urge you to look up that bit of history, which I actually wasn't familiar with until coming across your work, and again, making evident those kinds of absences or the things that we're just not taught, or things that are not made the most sort of salient or the most recognizable parts of history, despite them having happened, just in Australia, just across the way, really. So I wondered if you could speak a bit more about like that process of being in conversation with Mr. Murakami, with the help of, is it Dr. Yamada, I think, who's the interpreter? Can you, just speak us through that process a little bit?
Yeah, Mami-san, or Dr. Yamada, as you put it, she's actually got 3 PhDs, which I just find phenomenal. One of her PhDs is on Japanese POW experience. So she has known Mr. Murakami for years, about 15 plus years now. And she accompanies him to all of his speaking events, and has accompanied him on many of his trips back to Cowra. And his most recent trip was in 2019. So, only a few years ago. Mr. Murakami's still alive. And, he's 100 now. And, I think what comes out in that work, but is the sort of, how can I put it? He won't give a clear response to any of the questions or any of the prompts. And Mami-san is really pushing him. But of course she can do that because they have a long relationship. They have a respected relationship, and they're not breaching any of the protocols around what it means to relate for those two in the context they come from. But of course, none of that is explained in the work. And so for some viewers, that work's quite confronting, because it seems as if, Mami-san's like really kind of pushing him and going, come on, answer, you answered something different yesterday, so on and so forth. And actually they can do that because they're good friends. And so, at first I was unsure as if I should edit that into the work, but then I decided that that's actually a really good way in which to try and comprehend or try and be with something that's so enormous in terms of what he's talking about, that goes beyond simply trying to know. Like we'll never know or understand the complexity of his experience, but what it's like to live with that, and what it's like to keep returning to Cowra, to keep returning to see the graves of his friends. And and I guess in a lot of the works there is that same sense of complexity. I mean, we just talked about it with Ben. This like doing something that's supposedly for the greater good of a country, but it's a country that will never recognize him. For Mr. Murakami, he had no choice about what he was doing, in the sense of serving in the military in the first place, but also in terms of participating in the Cowra outbreak. Sorry, I shouldn't say that, breakout. I said outbreak. It's a COVID reference. Yeah. Yeah, the Cowra breakout. He had to participate in it, because actually to not would have been dishonorable to his other comrades, to his friends. And so he has this huge complexity of what he did, but also not learning in later life. And he can only do this now because he's the last surviving member of that particular incident, saying that he never wanted to die. You know, and so nothing is ever given in terms of the artwork. It doesn't give you a clear-cut, you know, version of what happened. It certainly doesn't give you a clear-cut way in which to think about it. But I think rather it asks us, well, I hope it asks us to learn to be gentle in our listening to somebody grapple with something so complex. And then how can we take that out into our lives, you know, and have well, for want of a better way to put it, a better or a different or a more layered socio-ethical response to what's happening currently in our lives, if that makes sense. And that's always something I'm trying to do, like to think about, yes, this history has, you know, it's 76 years ago that it finished, but it carries on in the lives and bodies of the people in our region. You know, it's not finished at all.
Okay, well, yeah, I was going to say just, yeah, thank you, Fiona, because I think there is, yeah, a way in which the suite of works allows us to sit with some difficulty as well. Like, I think in terms of trying to grapple with history, and it's sort of like, I guess it's ripples, its effects into the present. And as you mentioned in that final work we discussed, this idea of, I guess, being attuned to and listening to the difficulties of trying to recall, of trying to understand, is something that's, as it's quite significant, quite profound, I think. And I think as a body of work, it allows us to achieve that, and to think about that in a very significant way. But yeah.
Can I just say one thing in response to that, which is something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I completely agree with what you just said, that often with the works, you know, because they are such controversial, I guess, content, it's looking at American imperialism as well as Japanese imperialism. So, you know, we have strong responses to those histories. And one of the things I'm really interested in is, you know, how the work can create a space where, because the listening has been embodied, that actually there's no need to kind of have an opinion and say it out loud. How you might just hold that space that the work has created, and take that out into wherever you go next.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
It's been really enjoyable listening to you both and thinking it through differently through this conversation. I don't want to extend the discussion overly, but Fiona, I think one of the things we haven't touched on, and just thinking about your idea there of creating space or opportunity for reflection and without opinion, or to just be a participant, to hold the work and the experience of it, even as so far as holding trauma. The work that's left me with the most sort of curiosity, I guess, are the two photographs that surround the caves, because when we're hearing Mrs. Uehara, is it, talk about that personal experience, it's one of the toughest of the four video works, I think, in terms of her, and then the juxtaposition of the archival footage of the caves being torched adds to that experience. And then in the Walters Prize exhibition, as you've pointed to, both of you, the space is compressed and the photographs of the caves are very close, but the images are very silent. I just wondered if you wanted just to to finish by thinking about the way the photographs, your photographs, align with the narrative, the spoken narrative and the film narrative?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I would say that they align per se, but rather that you know, they are their own kind of moment of reflection, and it's perhaps that reflection that responds to particularly Mrs. Ebener's story, and then as you've just referenced, Mrs. Urahara. And you know, those images are, yeah, they're kind of eerily quiet. There's three of them, right?
Mm.
You know, one is of a very small suburban tree photographed against a wall, which looks a little bit like a ink print. And then the other two, one is of a tree on a cliff, and that was taken at when the sun was setting. And then the other is at the mouth of a cave, but it's actually quite far back from the mouth of the cave. So it's sort of the context of the cave. And all three images, in a way, they do what the video works are trying to do as well, in the sense that they don't give this kind of clear-cut narrative a way to be with the images. But what they do offer is a sort of respite, a moment of pause, a moment to be held. Actually, maybe the way I could think about them is they're a little bit like having a hug. They give you a hug so that you can get back in there and do the work that the artworks are asking you to do, the video works are asking you to do. Yeah, so they needed to be close to the screens because you know, they needed to have that connection.
Is it the case that the depth of field is quite short in those photographs too? There's a feeling that the distance with which you could be looking past the cliffs is really compressed as well. It's a strange atmosphere that you've created.
Yeah, it's the opposite actually. The depth of field is large, so it's a massive depth of field. But the cliff is very, very sloped, so it's very I don't know if that makes sense with my hand, but you know, it's would you call it a deep cliff? You know, and so that's why it gives that sense of space. But it's also the cliff that civilians took their own lives from. So they, you know, jumped, committed suicide, jumped to avoid being captured by both Japanese and American troops.
Yeah.
And actually that footage is in a Chris Marker film.